I will give my wife to whoever defeats me. And a rancher rose up against the Apache chief. The year was 1880, and the southwestern United States was a land of both beauty and brutality. Desolate deserts stretched for miles, interrupted only by the jagged peaks of mountains and the dry riverbeds that cut through the land like scars. It was a place where survival depended on strength, wit, and sheer determination. For the settlers who called this harsh land home, every day was a battle. A battle against the land, the weather, and the constant threat of attack from the native Apache tribes who had been on this land for centuries. Among the settlers was a rancher named John, a man who had spent most of his life taming the wilderness. His farm was small, nestled in the valley near the Rio Grande. He wasn't a man of grand wealth, nor was he one of those whose name would echo in the halls of history. He was, however, a man with grit, someone who had survived everything the desert had thrown at him. Whether it was the blistering heat, the lack of water, or the never-ending struggle to raise cattle in a place so unforgiving, John always found a way to make it through. The land was a silent partner to him, and while he respected it, he never feared it. But as much as the land tested his resolve, there was a new, more dangerous force in the region, the Apache. Led by their fierce and respected chief, Geronimo, the Apache were known for their courage and skill in battle. They were a constant threat to the settlers, raiding their farms and ranches, taking cattle and leaving destruction in their wake. The settlers feared the Apache, but none more so than the ranchers like John, who had everything to lose. They were a people who believed in their right to live on the land, but now, that right was being questioned every time a tribe like the Apache decided to raid their homes. It wasn't just cattle that the Apache sought. They took what they wanted, and often that meant more than just physical possessions. They were known to take women from the settlers as well, a brutal tactic that spread fear and distrust among the ranchers. For many, it was a silent war, a war that was fought under the cover of night and in the shadows of the desert. But John had never considered running. He wasn't one to be scared away from his land. This was his home, and no one, not even the Apache, would take it from him without a fight. Then, one day, the unthinkable happened. News spread that Geronimo, the Apache chief himself, had issued a challenge. He had announced to all that he would give his wife to anyone who could defeat him in single combat. The words came like wildfire across the region, carried by the wind to every settlement, farm, and ranch. No one could believe it at first. Why would Geronimo make such a challenge? Was it a show of arrogance or something else? For some, it seemed like a farce. Who could defeat a man like Geronimo in combat? He was a warrior's warrior, a leader who had led countless successful raids. He had fought against the best, both native and settler, and emerged victorious time and time again. For others, the announcement was an insult. It wasn't just a challenge for a duel. It was an affront to the very way of life that the settlers held dear. The idea that a man could offer his wife as a prize to the victor was an unforgivable display of dominance. It was as if Geronimo was saying that the settlers were nothing more than toys, playthings in a game of power. The more John thought about it, the angrier he became. How dare Geronimo challenge them in such a manner? How could he treat human lives as though they were objects to be won in a contest? But what could he do? He was just one man, a rancher who had no desire for fame or glory. His life had been simple. He deworked the land, tended to his cattle, and lived each day as it came. But this was different. This challenge struck at something deeper, something personal. It wasn't just about winning a fight. It was about standing up for everything he had worked for and everything that was at risk. John wasn't the kind of man to back down from a fight, especially not when it came to his honor. He had worked hard for everything he had. He had built his ranch with his own hands, raised cattle in the harshest of conditions, and fought off smaller bands of Apache raiders over the years. He wasn't a great warrior, but he knew how to defend himself. And now it seemed that the greatest test of his life had been laid before him. In the days that followed, John's decision weighed heavily on his mind. He could hear the murmurs of other ranchers. Some laughed at the absurdity of the challenge, while others called it a fool's errand. "What chance does a rancher have against a warrior like Geronimo?" they'd say. But as John listened to the gossip, a fire began to burn within him. He knew that if he didn't step up, he would live with the shame for the rest of his life. It wasn't about winning Geronimo's wife. It was about standing up for himself, for his land, and for his people. It was early one morning when John made up his mind. He would answer Geronimo's challenge. He didn't know how he would win. He didn't know if he even stood a chance. But one thing was certain. He could not let this insult go unchallenged. Geronimo needed to know that the settlers would not bow down in the face of fear. John knew that if he didn't take this stand, others would think they could do the same. The Apache might think they had the upper hand, but it was time for that to change. Gathering his things, John rode out toward the heart of Apache country. The journey was long and dangerous, the land as unforgiving as ever. As he rode through the rough terrain, he thought about the fight ahead. How would it play out? What would it take to defeat a man like Geronimo? He wasn't a fool, he knew the risks. But he also knew that a man like him had no choice but to face his fears head-on. The closer he got to the Apache camp, the more the weight of his decision began to settle in. He wasn't just going to face Geronimo in combat. He was walking straight into the heart of enemy territory. He would be surrounded by men who would likely want him dead the moment he arrived. But that didn't matter. This was about proving something bigger than himself. This was about showing that no matter how fierce the opponent, there was always room for one more fight in a man's heart. By the time he reached the Apache stronghold, John was no longer the same man who had set out on the journey. The path had changed him. Now all that remained was to face Geronimo and prove once, and for all that courage could still outweigh fear, no matter the odds. John's decision to face Geronimo wasn't an easy one. The road ahead would be filled with uncertainty, and the fear of what might happen lingered in the back of his mind. But he had committed to his path, and there was no turning back now. As he rode through the unforgiving landscape toward the heart of Apache territory, every mile seemed to stretch longer than the last. The land, harsh and dry, mirrored the battle that was about to unfold. This wasn't just about proving himself in a fight. It was about defending everything he stood for, everything he had worked so hard to protect. The journey wasn't just physically grueling, it was mentally exhausting. Every night as he set up camp under the stars, John would lie awake staring at the sky, his thoughts swirling. Was he making the right decision? What if he failed? What if Geronimo was too powerful, too skilled? But in those quiet moments, he would remember why he was doing this in the first place. It wasn't about the prize. It wasn't about taking Geronimo's wife. It was about standing firm in the face of injustice, of showing that even the most unlikely of men could rise up against a force of nature like Geronimo. He couldn't back down. Not now. The days wore on, and John's determination only grew stronger. Each morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, he reminded himself why he had chosen this path. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about anger. It was about honor. The honor of the settlers who had worked hard to build a life on this land. The honor of those who had lost their homes to the Apache raids. And the honor of standing tall in the face of a challenge that seemed impossible. The more he thought about it, the more resolute he became. He had to do this. Along the way, John encountered other ranchers and settlers. Some offered words of caution, warning him against the dangers of facing Geronimo. "That man is a legend," one rancher told him. "No one has ever beaten him in a fight." Others, however, spoke with admiration in their eyes, proud that someone was finally willing to stand up to the Apache. They had all suffered from the raids, the theft of their cattle, and the constant fear that hung over them like a dark cloud. But none had been brave enough to challenge Geronimo directly. John's decision had ignited a spark in their hearts, a reminder that they, too, had the right to defend their homes and their families. Still, even with the encouragement of some and the warnings of others, John knew that the real challenge lay ahead. As the days passed, the weight of what he was about to face became clearer. Geronimo was no ordinary man. He was a leader, a warrior whose reputation had spread far and wide. His name struck fear into the hearts of many. John wasn't naive. He knew that this would be a battle like no other, and the outcome was uncertain. But he had made up his mind. He would face Geronimo with everything he had. Finally, after days of travel, John arrived at the edge of Apache country. The land here felt different, darker, more oppressive. The winds seemed to carry the whispers of a people who had lived in these deserts for generations, who knew the land like the back of their hands. John rode cautiously, aware that he was deep in enemy territory now. Every movement, every sound could be a warning, yet he pressed on. He had to. Soon John reached a small village where he was met by an Apache scout. The man's face was stern, his eyes cold as he looked John up and down. Geronimo has been expecting you, the scout said flatly, his voice betraying no emotion. Follow me. Without another word, the scout turned and began walking, leading John deeper into the heart of the Apache encampment. As they walked, John could see the watchful eyes of the Apache, their gaze following him wherever he went. Some stared with curiosity, others with suspicion. John couldn't blame them. He was an outsider, a settler who had come to challenge their chief. But he refused to show fear. He walked with his head held high, determined not to let the anxiety gnaw at him. This was what he had come for. This was what he had prepared for. The scout led him to a large clearing where Geronimo stood waiting. The chief was a commanding figure, tall and muscular, his face hardened by years of war. His eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto John's as soon as he arrived. There was no warmth in them, only a coldness that spoke of the many battles Geronimo had fought and won. He was a man who had seen it all, a man who had earned his place as a leader of the Apache. John stood before him, feeling the weight of the moment. It wasn't just the physical presence of Geronimo that made him uneasy. It was the realization that this was no simple duel. This was a confrontation between two men from different worlds, two men with everything at stake. For Geronimo, this was a challenge to his authority. For John, it was a fight for his honor and the future of the settlers. "Are you ready?" Geronimo's voice was low, almost a growl. There was no question in his tone. This was not an invitation, it was a command. John took a deep breath. He didn't know if he was ready, but he knew that he had no choice. He couldn't back down now. "I'm ready," he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. Geronimo nodded and motioned for the two men to step into the center of the clearing. Around them, the Apache warriors gathered, watching intently, their eyes fixed on the two men who would determine the outcome of this strange and deadly challenge. The air was thick with anticipation, the silence broken only by the rustle of the wind through the desert brush. The fight was about to begin. As John took his position, he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about survival, it was about everything he had fought for in his life. His family, his land, his honor, everything was on the line. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all the settlers who had suffered at the hands of the Apache. Geronimo's stance was perfect, his muscles coiled and ready to spring into action. John, though not as skilled or experienced, had his own strengths. He had spent years working the land, building his body through hard labor and constant physical challenge. He wasn't a trained fighter, but he had learned how to defend himself when the need arose. This wasn't just a battle of strength, it was a battle of strategy and willpower. The two men circled each other, each waiting for the other to make the first move. John's heart pounded in his chest, and his breath came in shallow gasps. He could feel the weight of every eye upon him, but he pushed the fear aside. This was his moment, and he would make the most of it. Without warning, Geronimo lunged forward, his body moving with the speed and precision of a predator. John barely had time to react as the Apache chief's fist flew toward him. He ducked just in time, feeling the air rush past his face as the blow missed. Geronimo was fast, his attacks relentless. John had no time to waste, he had to think quickly. He darted to the side, hoping to avoid Geronimo's next strike, but the Apache chief was already anticipating his move. Geronimo twisted and came at him again, his fists flying with brutal force. John was barely able to parry the blows, his arms aching with the effort. This wasn't a fight he had ever been prepared for, but he couldn't let that stop him. He had to keep fighting. The battle between John and Geronimo had started with an intensity that John had never imagined. From the moment they had locked eyes, it was clear that this wasn't going to be an ordinary fight. Geronimo moved with the confidence of someone who had been through countless battles. His every strike, every movement was calculated, as if he knew exactly what would happen next. John, on the other hand, was doing his best to hold his ground, to keep himself from being overwhelmed. The Apache chief's blows came fast and furious, each one testing John's ability to survive. John knew that he couldn't rely on strength alone. Geronimo was bigger, stronger, and far more experienced in hand-to-hand combat. But John had something else on his side, his quick thinking. He had grown up on the land, had spent years working under the sun, and knew how to use his surroundings to his advantage. Every time Geronimo attacked, John moved, dodging and weaving, hoping to avoid the full force of each blow. The heat of the desert sun bore down on them, but neither man seemed to notice. All that mattered was the fight at hand. The two men circled each other, each waiting for the other to make a move. John's breath was coming in quick gasps now, and his muscles were beginning to ache. He knew he couldn't keep this up forever. His body wasn't built for long, drawn-out fights like Geronimo's was. He had to find a way to end this quickly. Geronimo, on the other hand, showed no sign of slowing down. His face remained impassive, his eyes locked on John with a predator's focus. He was used to fighting battles that demanded every ounce of his energy, and this duel was no different. But John wasn't about to give up, not when everything was at stake. The sound of the desert wind and the faint rustling of the brush were the only things that could be heard, as the two men stood facing each other, ready for the next move. For a moment, time seemed to stretch, and everything around them faded into the background. John's world was narrowed to just Geronimo, to the fight, to the decision that lay in front of him. If he could survive this, if he could outlast Geronimo, then he would have one more than just a physical battle. He would have won respect, not just from Geronimo, but from the Apache warriors who were watching this fight. He would show them that a rancher, someone they probably saw as weak or inferior, could stand against one of their greatest leaders. John made his move. He feigned a strike to the left, hoping to trick Geronimo into overcommitting to a defensive move. It worked. As Geronimo reacted, John quickly pivoted and aimed a blow to the side of the Apache chief's head. The strike landed, but it wasn't enough to knock Geronimo down. Instead, Geronimo grunted, his eyes flashing with fury. He was not a man who could be easily swayed or outsmarted, and John could see that. With a roar, Geronimo lunged forward, his fist swinging with the power of a storm. John barely managed to dodge, feeling the gust of wind from the punch as it flew past him. He had to move quickly or he'd be caught. With all his strength, he pushed forward, his feet kicking up dust as he dashed toward Geronimo. He knew that he couldn't let the chief dictate the pace of the fight. If he was going to survive, he had to be the one to control it. John reached Geronimo and swung, his fist landing squarely on the chief's ribs. It wasn't the hardest punch, but it was enough to make Geronimo stagger back for a moment. The brief pause was all John needed. He pressed forward, throwing punch after punch, trying to wear Geronimo down to find an opening. He wasn't used to fighting like this, but he had no choice. This was his only chance. Geronimo recovered quickly, his warrior's instincts kicking in as he blocked John's blows and countered with his own. John was knocked back by the force of one of Geronimo's strikes, and he stumbled, almost falling to the ground. His head spun, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. He couldn't afford to lose focus, not now. The Apache chief stepped forward again, his movements a blur of speed and strength. John barely had time to react as Geronimo's fist slammed into his stomach. Pain exploded through him, but he gritted his teeth and stood tall. This wasn't the time to show weakness. He was a rancher, a man who had worked through every challenge life had thrown at him. He wouldn't let this fight be any different. Blood trickled from a cut above John's eye, and his vision began to blur. He wiped his face with his sleeve, but the blood kept coming. He was losing strength, and he knew it, but he refused to give in. He had to find a way to end this fight. He had to show Geronimo that he wasn't just a settler, he was a man who could stand his ground. The two men were locked in a fierce struggle now, neither giving an inch. John's muscles burned with exhaustion, his body battered from the fight, but he kept pushing, kept moving, determined not to let Geronimo have the upper hand. With every swing of his fists, he poured every ounce of his strength into the battle. He knew that if he didn't, he would lose. There was no other option. The stakes were too high, and then in a flash of movement, something shifted. Geronimo's foot slipped slightly on the loose dirt beneath them. It was a small misstep, but it was enough. John saw the opening and took it without hesitation. He drove his fist into Geronimo's side with all the force he could muster, and this time it was enough. Geronimo staggered, his breath coming in heavy gasps as he tried to regain his balance. The Apache chief's face twisted with pain, and for the first time in the fight, John saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. John didn't wait for Geronimo to recover. With a sudden burst of energy, he lunged forward, tackling the chief to the ground. They crashed to the dirt, a cloud of dust rising around them. John's hands were on Geronimo's shoulders, pushing him down, holding him there. For a moment, they were both still, locked in a battle of wills. John could feel the chief's strength beneath him, but he held on, determined not to let go. Geronimo's breathing was labored, and his hands were pushing against John's chest, trying to throw him off. But John didn't let up. He could feel the fight draining out of the chief, his strength fading as the minutes wore on. This was it. This was the moment John had been waiting for. He had to finish it now, or it would all be for nothing. With one final push, John pinned Geronimo to the ground, his chest heaving with exhaustion. He had won. The Apache chief was down, and for the first time in the fight, the silence was deafening. John's heart raced as he looked down at Geronimo, who was now breathing heavily, his face a mixture of pain and disbelief. He had been defeated. The Apache warriors around them stood still, watching in silence. No one moved, no one spoke. It felt like the entire world had stopped in that moment, waiting for something, anything to happen. John's mind raced, but he didn't take his eyes off Geronimo. He had done it. He had won. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time since it had started, John allowed himself a moment of relief. He had faced the impossible and survived. And now he would show Geronimo and the Apache people that even the most unlikely of men could rise to meet any challenge. John could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The fight with Geronimo had been longer and harder than he had ever imagined. His body ached, each muscle protesting with every movement, but his mind was clear. He had pushed past the pain, driven by the thought of what was at stake. This wasn't just a fight for himself. It was for everyone who had suffered under the Apache raids, for every settler who had lost their home, their cattle, their families. Geronimo, on the other hand, was still trying to regain his composure. Though he was no longer as quick as he had been at the beginning of the fight, the chief was far from defeated. His eyes burned with defiance as he slowly pushed himself off the ground, his muscles tense with the effort. He was a warrior, a leader, and he was not accustomed to being beaten. But John could see it now, the crack in the armor, the vulnerability that had appeared when he had landed that final blow. Geronimo was human, after all, and for the first time in their fight, John could sense that the Apache chief was unsure. As Geronimo rose to his feet, John didn't hesitate. He wasn't about to give the chief a chance to recover. With a sharp intake of breath, he lunged forward, his body moving on instinct. The fight had taken so much out of him, but he had to keep going, had to press on. He couldn't afford to let this opportunity slip away. His hands, bloodied and bruised, aimed for Geronimo's shoulders, attempting to bring the chief down again. But Geronimo, though exhausted, was still a formidable opponent. The Apache chief twisted and dodged, using his last reserves of strength to avoid John's assault. The two men grappled again, their movements slower now, more labored. John's strength was fading, his arms growing heavier with each push, but he refused to let up. He had come too far to fail now. His thoughts were clear. He needed to outlast Geronimo to break his resolve. He had fought for so long against not just the Apache, but against everything life had thrown his way. He wasn't about to let it all end here, but Geronimo was a warrior, and a fierce one at that. He grunted as he pushed John back, his hand landing on John's chest with enough force to knock him off balance. John stumbled but quickly regained his footing. Sweat dripped down his forehead and his muscles burned with the strain. He was tired, so tired, but he kept his focus. He couldn't let Geronimo see weakness, not now. For a moment the two men stood facing each other, both breathing heavily. The silence was thick, the only sound the harsh, labored breaths they took as they prepared for the next move. It felt like time had slowed, as if the entire world was holding its breath. John's mind raced as he looked at Geronimo. This was the moment. The chief was on the edge. John could see it in his eyes. He just needed one more chance. Geronimo seemed to sense this too, and with a battle cry that echoed through the desert, he lunged forward again, hoping to overwhelm John with one final attack. The speed and power behind the chief's movements were impressive, and John barely had time to react. He sidestepped just out of reach of Geronimo's grasp, but the force of the blow knocked him off balance once more. This time, John didn't hesitate. As Geronimo moved past him, John pivoted quickly, using all the strength he had left to grab hold of the chief's arm. He twisted and pulled, and with a sharp motion he slammed Geronimo to the ground. It was a risky move, one that required every ounce of energy John had left, but it worked. Geronimo grunted as he hit the ground, the impact echoing in the silence of the clearing. John stood over him, chest heaving, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew this was the moment that would decide everything. Geronimo was on the ground now, and though the chief's strength was formidable, it seemed to have finally begun to fade. John had the upper hand, but he knew he couldn't let up. One wrong move, one moment of hesitation, and the fight could turn again. The Apache warriors watching from the sidelines had fallen silent. John could feel their eyes on him, but he didn't dare look away from Geronimo. This fight was between the two of them, and it would end when one of them was no longer able to continue. As John looked down at Geronimo, he saw a glimmer of respect in the chief's eyes. There was no fear, no anger, just a quiet acknowledgement that the fight had taken everything out of both of them. John crouched down, his hand still gripping Geronimo's arm, and he stared into the chief's eyes. "It's over," John said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "You've lost." Geronimo didn't respond at first. He just lay there, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. It was a moment of stillness, a brief pause in the chaos of the fight, as if the entire world was waiting for Geronimo to make the next move. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Geronimo spoke. His voice was low, almost resigned. "You are strong, rancher," he said, his words carrying weight. "Stronger than I thought. I was wrong to underestimate you." John's grip on Geronimo's arm tightened slightly, but he didn't pull away. He couldn't afford to let go just yet. "It's not about strength," John said quietly. "It's about what you're willing to fight for." For a long moment, neither man moved. The only sound was the wind in the distance, rustling the dry brush that surrounded them. John could feel the exhaustion in his bones, but he didn't dare relax. He was so close to the end, so close to proving that even the unlikeliest of men could stand tall against a legend. Geronimo let out a sigh, a sound of both frustration and acceptance. Slowly, carefully, he raised his hand and placed it on John's arm. It was a gesture of surrender, a quiet admission that the fight was over. John didn't move, didn't speak, but he felt a sense of victory, not just for himself, but for all the settlers who had been affected by the Apache raids. This was more than just a duel. It was a turning point. John slowly released Geronimo's arm, stepping back to give the chief room to rise. For a moment, Geronimo stayed on the ground, his hands resting on the earth as he caught his breath. He didn't speak again for a long while, and John didn't push him to. The Apache chief had been a fierce opponent, and John respected him for that. But respect didn't change the fact that Geronimo had made a challenge, and John had answered it. As Geronimo rose to his feet, he looked John in the eye, a new understanding between them. "You've earned my respect," he said, his voice steady but worn. "You've won, rancher." John nodded, the weight of the words settling over him. The battle was over, but the journey was. What mattered now was the respect that had been earned, not just through fists but through determination, through standing firm when it seemed like everything was against you. For the first time in the fight, John allowed himself to breathe fully, the tension in his body easing. He had done it. He had stood against Geronimo and come out victorious. But more than that, he had proved that a rancher, a man of the land, could hold his own against one of the greatest warriors the world had ever known. And in that moment, standing in the desert, surrounded by the warriors of the Apache tribe, John knew that he had changed the course of history. John stood there, still breathing heavily, the weight of the fight slowly lifting off his shoulders. The desert sun beat down on him, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he felt something else. Relief. He had done it. Against all odds, he had faced one of the fiercest warriors in the land and survived. The pain in his muscles, the exhaustion in his body, none of it mattered now. What mattered was that he had proven himself, not just to Geronimo, but to everyone watching, and most importantly, to himself. As Geronimo slowly rose to his feet, John stayed quiet, watching the chief carefully. He had never expected to win, never thought he'd be standing here in the aftermath of this battle. But as Geronimo stood tall once more, John realized that this wasn't just about a fight. It was about respect, about breaking the barriers between two worlds that had been at odds for so long. It was about showing that, despite the differences between settlers and the Apache, there was something greater than their conflict: courage, determination, and honor. Geronimo seemed to notice this as well. The fire that had burned in his eyes when they first began the fight had dimmed, replaced with something else, something akin to respect. For the first time in their battle, the Apache chief gave John a nod. It was subtle, but it held more meaning than any words could convey. It was the acknowledgement of a worthy opponent, a man who had faced him head-on and earned his place. You have earned more than my respect, rancher. Geronimo's voice was deeper now, filled with the weight of battle. You have earned my admiration. John didn't know what to say. For all his life, he had been raised to believe that a man's worth was proven by his actions. Words were meaningless if they weren't backed by deeds. And here, in this moment, the actions spoke louder than anything either of them could say. John had proven himself not through strength alone, but through his ability to hold his ground, to stay true to his beliefs, and to never back down, no matter the odds. I came here to prove that settlers aren't just weak men hiding behind walls, John said slowly, his voice rough from the exertion. We are here to stand tall, just like anyone else. We fight for our families, our homes, and our way of life. I didn't come here for glory or to take something from you, Geronimo. I came here to show that we're not just prey, we're people. Geronimo's eyes softened, the hard edge to his gaze dulling as he took in John's words. I see that now, he said, his voice quieter. You are a man of honor. I thought you would be like the others who come, who run when they see the first sign of danger. But you are different. You are not like the men who sit in their homes, hiding behind their doors and fences. John looked around at the Apache warriors who had gathered, watching the fight with quiet intensity. There was no anger in their eyes now, no hostility. Instead, they watched with something that resembled understanding. They too had witnessed what had just happened, and it was clear that they saw John not as an enemy but as a man who had earned his place among them. The chief stepped closer, his posture no longer threatening. He extended his hand to John, the gesture both simple and profound. You have proven your strength, rancher. You have earned the right to live freely on this land as we do. I will not stand in your way. For a moment, John just stood there, unsure of how to respond. He had come here expecting a fight, expecting to prove himself in a battle of strength. But what he hadn't anticipated was this moment of mutual understanding, where a rancher and an Apache chief could meet on common ground, not as enemies, but as equals. Slowly, John reached out and took Geronimo's hand. The firm handshake was an unspoken bond, a symbol that their fight had led to something greater than a victory. It had led to a new beginning. The Apache warriors around them stood still, watching the two men closely. For a long while there was no sound, just the steady rhythm of the wind. But in that silence, something shifted. The tension that had hung over the desert, over the land for so long, seemed to dissipate. It wasn't gone, not completely, but it had been softened, shaped into something that could be built upon. Geronimo finally spoke, his voice low, but with a weight that carried across the clearing. I was wrong to think that all settlers were the same. You have shown me that not all of you are cowards. Not all of you will bend in the face of fear. Perhaps, in time, we can learn to coexist. Perhaps we can find a way to share this land as we both have a right to it. John's heart swelled with the weight of Geronimo's words. He had never expected this kind of recognition. It wasn't about winning a battle or claiming a prize. It was about changing the way things had been for so long, about showing that there was more to both the settlers and the Apache than just conflict and bloodshed. For the first time since he had arrived, John felt a sense of peace settle over him. The fight was over. The tension that had once consumed him, that had driven him to this moment, seemed to fall away, replaced by something that felt like a new beginning. We have a long way to go, John said, his voice calm now, his exhaustion momentarily forgotten. But if we're willing to try, we can find a way to make this work. We don't have to fight forever. We can learn from each other. I think we both know that the land is big enough for all of us. Geronimo nodded, the weight of his years as a leader and a warrior reflected in his eyes. Perhaps we can, he said, and for the first time in their interaction, there was a glimmer of hope in his voice. The Apache warriors who had gathered around them began to murmur amongst themselves. They, too, were witnessing something unprecedented. A rancher and an Apache chief, once enemies, now standing together, united in a shared belief that there could be a future that didn't have to be defined by violence. As John looked around at the Apache tribe, he saw not just warriors, but people who had lived their lives as they saw fit, just as he had. He saw the same determination in their eyes that he had felt in his own heart when he had first stood up to Geronimo. They, too, had fought for something. They had fought for their way of life, for their land, for their families. And in that moment, John realized that, despite their differences, they were more alike than they were different. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the desert, Geronimo turned to John one last time. You have earned my respect, rancher. and you have earned the respect of my people. From this day forward, we will not stand in your way. We will share this land as we must, and perhaps one day we can call each other allies." John nodded, the weight of the words sinking in. He had come here to prove something, but what he had found was so much more. He had found a new path, one where peace was possible, even in the most unlikely of places. And as he looked out over the land, the vast, sun-baked desert stretching out before him, John felt the first flicker of hope for the future. The fight had ended, and in its place, something new had begun.